Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Kai. Flew just in from Germany, so my inner clock tells me it's like 9 p.m. right now. So usually a time where I should sit in front of a TV and start goofing off. So I'll try to make this a little more interactive so I don't actually goof off. So if you're expecting the usual like German slide deck that I read all the bullet points to you, like very exact and watch at this all the time. I won't do that today because otherwise I would be falling asleep myself within seconds. And also referring to my friend Andy Bachman, who stayed at the title slide for like minutes because that's what you're supposed to do. See what I just did there. I stay here for one more minute. Yeah. Actually, my last day in the office at Audi was this Friday, so there's going to be a small change. I'm going to the black hole of ICS cybersecurity folks called Dragos in 2 weeks. Looking forward to that. Yeah, absolutely. Known Rob Lee for 10 years now, so it was about time. Yeah, I teach for SANS. Happen to be, unfortunately, the only German-speaking German instructor. There's a couple more German-speaking. They're all Austrians. And it's a bit with like with the US folks and the British. We speak the same language. Sometimes we kind of are not the same. So if you're from Germany and like to teach for SANS, you might want to talk to me. So what is this about? My soon-to-be colleague, Leslie Carhart, some of you might follow her on Twitter, Hacks for Pancakes, used to call tabletop exercises Revenge of the Nerds. Who of you, so let's start interacting here. Who of you has played role-playing games in college or school? Certainly me, yeah. So all that stuff where people told us, yeah, you nerds, this is never gonna help you out anywhere, ever. Welcome to tabletop exercises. But before we get into that, just real quick, what I will do with you, introduction, why should we do this, why exercise, why train at all, and then we'll walk through a couple of scenarios. That being said, yes, there's text on the slides, yes, you can get the slides afterwards, of course, so I'll tell a couple of stories around that you probably wouldn't put into slides because large corporations and the legal issues when you try to get slides allowed for a presentation, right? So, why do we do this? Of course, since I've known Rob for a long time, I love little Bobby, like all of us, right, in ICS. So number one thing that we should do always is, of course, have a plan when we do incident response. So another question here for all of you, who has an incident response plan? I certainly do, because I run an incident response team. So I saw a couple of hands. But we all know that, right? And just if you think back to the previous two presentations, actually, what Jason told you about things that might go wrong. So obviously attackers do have to have plans if they just, what was that? Your president telling when the 2016 elections were, it might have been just a 400-pound guy in a basement. That's usually not how attacks work, right? You need a lot of preparation and planning to accomplish something. Same for us defenders, and everybody in incident response knows that, right? Otherwise, we have what we love all the time, headless chicken mode. Doesn't really make your day. But what's the next problem with plans? They're usually worthless if we never exercise them, right? Here's one example that I come up with all the time. So most of the stuff that I'll be showing to you is actually not from IT security or not from IT at all, because IT folks sometimes are strange. You might be able to relate to that. For some strange reason, we think that just because computers, the problem hasn't been there before. If we talk to other folks from other fields that we actually touch, then we figure out that most of the problems have been there since the beginning of time. We just optimize them with computers and make them larger. That's what computers usually do, right? So if we think about incident response or any type of meaningful response, we need a plan that we can act on. Of course, plans must be exercised, usually for a couple of reasons. First, just because you write something down, a plan, doesn't mean anything, right? It's just words on a screen or a piece of paper if you've done any type of continuity, and consider the fact that computers might be down, so you, of course, print the plan, but it's still just stuff on paper, right? You've never really verified if the plan actually works if you haven't exercised it. Also, you need to familiarize yourselves with the plan. So if you just read it, is that familiarization? Does that work? Probably not, right? And also, who's an incident responder, by the way, here? Who does incident response on a regular basis? So a few of you. The first thing that usually breaks when things go sideways and hanging in these various rooms and outside today, following the discussions people had here, it's usually like communications, crisis management, communication between different teams that have totally different backgrounds, different cultures, all of that. So that works great. So I give you an example from the auto industry that you would all love, because we have our own acronyms, of course, and we overload the already existing ones. So SOP in the automotive industry is never, ever standard operating procedures. It's start of production. And you will never reset that date. What we actually do is then we have start of production, we ship a vehicle and we park it somewhere because it's already still totally broken, and then 2 months later you get the actual vehicle. But just one of the terms. So if you go into an automotive company, for example, and want to talk about your standard operating procedures, nobody would understand you that works on the shop floor or in R&D, because you're not speaking the same language. Also, stress levels are important. So if you've been in incident response cases or in other cases where things go sideways, just think back before the break, Andy's talk about bad things happening and about, especially in critical infrastructure, how you estimate risk. When things start going sideways, the pulse goes up. When the pulse goes up, you lose certain types of mental abilities. There's a great book on that by David Grossman on combat, so it doesn't have anything to do with cyber whatsoever. And I won't go all German on you now, mentioning that cyber physical is crazy because cybernetics is already physical. No. But the thing is, again, we already know from loads of studies that once things become stressful for humans, there's trouble with memorization, perception, creating plans ad hoc, being creative, and all of that. So we need to train for stressful situations. Everybody else that has responder in their job title actually knows that. And for some strange reason, mainly in IT, we think if we're incident responders, we don't need to train that much. It's just okay if we go to a SANS training once a year and come to a couple of conferences. And that doesn't really work. There are also a couple of legal requirements just to have a plan at least. So since I'm from Germany, Europe, these are the ones you have to work with in Europe, and if you happen to have a company outside of Europe that does business in Europe, you fall under this legislation as well. So GDPR, you've heard about this a lot, and just this morning, Tim Cook from Apple again mentioned that he's a big fan of it, and he wants it everywhere and even harder than it currently is. I can tell you that it's great fun working with GDPR because every MOTED infection we have to report to the authorities, so sometimes the days get very long. But also Network Information Security Directive that gets implemented in local laws in the countries in Germany, which basically means critical infrastructure protection. And the definition of critical infrastructure sometimes depends on different countries' view of what's critical and what's not. So your mileage might vary depending on what country you're dealing with in Europe. But you probably have the same or similar regulations in other countries as well. I mean, look at NERC-CIP, all this stuff. Basically, it requires you to have certain controls and measures and also response capabilities in your organization nowadays. But again, plans must be exercised because usually this is what happens in real life, right? So things go wrong. Who's responsible? Who does what? Have they even talked to one another? Do they even know the other teams exist? Do they even know what might be a root cause. So those of you already working in incident response, do you have ICS visibility? I kind of don't in some areas, but I'm kind of like here. But probably not, right? So of course we have to do the homework. But even more important, at least we should know who to talk to on the other side. And the other side, of course, is always a question of perception, right? The other folks, if we're IT, OT, doesn't matter. If we're responsible for responding to faults or critical situations in our organizations, we better know how to deal with the other responders, how to collaborate with them, how to work effectively as a team of teams, and how to speak their language, and how to call them when something happens, and figure out what the root cause might be for something happening. Think back to Jason's presentation on cyber attacks against physical infrastructure and how things might go wrong in ways that you don't actually expect. Or think what Andy just told you, especially the slide he showed with INL's definition of a threat is what I favor a lot. So my team works with that and not with the ISO definition, which I kind of have my issues with. Because a failing hard drive, if you follow this ISO stuff by the letter, is also a security incident, and I don't want my 8-person team to run after every failing hard drive in my organization all day. But knowing who to call and what part of our plant might be malfunctioning is actually an issue, especially if you have large environments. So Volkswagen Group runs 122 assembly manufacturing plants all over the planet. It might be car assemblies, it might be components, all of that. But just knowing where all of these are can be kind of challenging. And then knowing what vehicles actually get made in these various plants at a certain point in time is also quite challenging, because sometimes, of course, we switch these around when we change our production. So this can be, just by itself, very interesting. And it will probably be the same in much of manufacturing as well. Who of you is familiar with the OODA Loop? A couple of guys. So anecdote here, this was invented by one American fighter pilot, William J. Boyd, at the end of the Second World War. The American part of my family also happens to go by the name of Boyd. I don't know if they're any relations, but I kind of like the OODA Loop. So what do I use this for? Certainly not for incident response, but this is pretty effective when you want to teach people that are not used to dealing with crisis situations and what to do in a critical situation. So if you go full crisis mode, if you have to have a task force, if you have to deal with something, give folks the mechanics of what to actually do, how to structure your work. So you observe something. So figure out what's important. So figure out the situation first. Then you orient yourself. What's the most important thing we have to do right now? Decide on that. So you have to have a discussion about that, hopefully not too long. So you have to learn how to have effective, brief discussions. And then you act on that. And then you go through the cycle again and again and again until the crisis situation is over. And if people are not used to that, what usually happens is that all of this goes all over the place. So out of order, decisions not being made, observations not being communicated, orientation going the wrong way, so not prioritizing correctly depending on the situation, and acting happens in between. So we don't want that. So this is what we train, especially top management, that has so managers that have a function, directors, leadership that have a function in critical situations should train this frequently. And with top management, frequently sometimes means once a year, because they have pretty full schedules to begin with. So let's look at a couple of exercises, what we can do. And again, as I mentioned, you can all read, so I won't go through all the bullet points here, but I'll tell you the stories of how we did that in my organization. So let's start with a very, very small one. What if? Let's just look at our plan. So What's the idea what we do? Number one, it might be you're onboarding new folks in your organization, new folks in your incident response team or your OT maintenance team. You can give them just a bunch of books or PDFs and have them read that stuff, and then hopefully they know what they have to do. What would be better though is walk them through a scenario. So imagine this happens, this is how we would go through it, and this is who you call, and this is the guy, and by the way, he's over there at the table, let's talk to him, things like that. So just following that. What you can also do is verify if your plan actually works. So what if also means, what if something happens, like think back again to Jason's presentation, what if something happens to the water pressure level in our water mains at our facility? We actually did that once. So the what if for that was, could we overpressurize the water in Audi's main plant, so plant in Ingolstadt, close to Munich, in the main plant, could we overpressurize the water? No, we couldn't, but what we figured out is we could lock the pumps, kind of break them so they could be easily unlocked, so water pressure would fall, and that had side implications. For example, the cooling system for certain important machines fails, like the generators for pressurized air. So all the air power tools at the assembly line don't work anymore. Or even worse, the welding robots that use mainly the laser welding robots, they need lots of cooling. That wouldn't work anymore, so probably fires would start all over. Small ones the fire department can easily deal with. We have an internal fire department, of course, but they couldn't use the hydrants, of course, because the water pressure was down. So they had to lay, of course, water lines to get water from a river nearby. They can all do that. But see the cascading effects already? Just if you go through that one what if, what happens? So this is a pretty good way of figuring out what if and could we actually respond to that if something like this happens. Also, some of the stuff that you might be observing by going through what if, you totally don't have on your radar for your own organization right now, because we don't know anything about our organization actually, especially if you're in IT. But same if we're in OT, because we have a good understanding of whatever it is, what we're responsible for on the shop floor or in the plant, but not the other side effects, again. Because everybody has just a segmented view of what's going on in our organization. And one of my most fun phases of preparing for these types of exercises is walking through the company. So actually I got started doing continuity at Audi, business continuity, and since it was a project run by the IT department, they call it IT service continuity, but actually I was doing business continuity, and my main task was walking around the company, asking people what the hell they were actually doing and how this company actually made money. And some of the things are these second-order side effects that you then look at that have implications even for the larger environment. So is a auto manufacturer, even in Germany, critical infrastructure? Absolutely not. But logistics are important for an automotive company because automotive companies have some of the most complicated and complex logistics operations on the planet, just-in-time logistics. So we have 140-ton trucks, which is the largest size you can legally get in Europe on the roads. So that would be your 18-wheelers, just a couple tons lighter. 100 in rotation every hour in the city of Ingolstadt. If logistics fail, especially when we have the shift change around 2 p.m., in 40 minutes, traffic will break down. So we'll close the Autobahn. We'll have to figure out how to park 100, 200, 300, 400, 600 trucks, depending on how long the outage takes, somewhere. Nobody has the space to park a couple of hundred trucks somewhere. So these things, if you talk to people in your organization, can get really, really interesting. And what you do is like talk to people in a way of like, if you really, really had a bad day and disliked our company, how would you damage it just from your point of view? What would you come up with? And just parking a truck at the wrong unloading station could already be enough, maybe. So let's look at a scenario here that is probably familiar to most of us. Who has had to deal with ransomware before? Yeah, I saw like 1-2 show of hands, so probably 90% here in this room. So important questions are, again, visibility. How quickly do we usually detect that? Usually by the canary in the coal mine, right? Somebody seeing something funny on their PC and calling the service desk. Who of you has read Andy Greenberg's Sandworm? So oh yeah, see 1 or 2 hands. The rest of you should read it. There's a couple of great examples, especially when it comes to ransomware in that book. NotPetya being one of them, WannaCry the other one. So speaking about WannaCry, when that happened with a lot of warning, so a lot of lead time for everyone involved. So in Europe, there were these news reports when WannaCry happened that a couple of the other auto manufacturers preventively shut down their manufacturing in parts of Germany and France. So those of you in any type of manufacturing industry, do you preventively shut down the money printing machine? Exactly, no. There is no way you would ever do that. Except if you want to get fired real quick. That's when you might want to do that. So obviously something happened. That wasn't enough for my organization as a warning, so we still didn't patch and then had WannaCry half a year later. We didn't have to stop manufacturing though, because actually some folks did train beforehand how to segment the network real quick when something else happens for totally different reasons. But real quick is relative when it comes to these types of terms. So it still took like the better part of 40 hours or so. And if you read Sandworm, when NotPetya hit Maersk, the shipping company, the worm went through the network and I think Andy writes like something like 6 minutes, but even if it would have been 10 minutes, I mean, that's your reaction time. So there's probably not very much you can do there. But on these low-level exercises, let's get started with the easy stuff. I see something like I get a call from the service desk that somewhere close to the ICS, maybe just in an office in the ICS environments, it might have office computers involved, so people reading emails, something happened. So it might be ransomware. So how does that call and that detection go through your organization? Who calls whom? Does the service desk know that if it's close to the ICS that they should probably accelerate the process? Is there even an accelerated procedure, or do you have to come up with something right now, this second? Once this gets on your desk, how much time has passed? Do you know who to call if you have to really accelerate your reaction? Do you know who to call in leadership? Do you know who to brief? Do you know how much time you have to prepare those briefings? Do you know what happens if you forget somebody in that loop? And I can assure you that in large organizations, the worst thing that can happen to you is under-communication, because people that feel left out of the loop politically probably won't help you along the road. So all of these things are usually the small what-if scenarios that we walk through. And what-if can be done in like Friday noon, get pizza in, sit down with your plan, and some idea of some segment of your environment that you just want to think about if something like this happens in this part of our environment that we're responsible for. What do you need for this? Of course, if you don't have an incident response plan yet, and I remember that a couple of you guys didn't show their hands when I asked this question. So those of you that haven't had the resources allocated for creating incident response plan, this type of tabletop exercise, this really easy one, might be interesting if you've done this a couple of times internally in your team to do with leadership and show them what if. And you might want to reread the slides from Jason and Andy to come up with a couple of what-if ideas for your environment, walk them through it, and show them the consequences. And that should get you at least some resources allocated to at least do some proper planning and then exercising those plans. What you do need, though, is a good understanding of your environment. Again, think back to what Jason showed you. The hardest thing for the adversary is actually knowing how your environment works, and even if they know that you have a talcum powder manufacturing site, there's like 27 different ways of setting that up. Do you know how your environment works? Do you know who to call to ask? Do you know how to talk to them? These are the interesting things here that get you started in this first type of exercise. Something happens, who would we actually call, and do we already know at least the basic stuff that they hopefully told us sometime? And of course, as with any type of tabletop exercise, someone with prior experience in creating scenarios for whatever type of what if is very helpful, and that's why I was asking for role-playing gamers. Because you guys already know that. You've been game masters probably for a couple of years when you were playing these games in high school or college, and you know exactly how to create scenarios. Keep in mind that you don't want to create scenarios where everybody loses. Your players hated that back in the day. Your leadership will hate it even more, and you as a consequence, but come up with interesting scenarios that just bind people for an hour or two. And even just a small thing like this can become really, really interesting and fun to actually do. And it gives you a lot of reasoning internally for walking through the whole of your organization and the whole of your sites and just looking at stuff and asking people crazy questions. What if that machine back there starts making funny noises? Things like that. Fire drills, really important. Exercise processes and methods, and exercise them really well. Think back to the slide I had before with that combat stress performance. Just quickly, I won't go back to the slide, but just quickly to recap that. So why is stress important, but also a danger for us when it comes to critical situations? So when we're relaxed, which I'm probably not right now. I'm a little bit agitated because I have to talk in front of a crowd and the light is shining directly in my eyes and all that. It told me a couple of times, don't stare into the lights. I'm like a moth, like and also jet lagged. So what happens when your pulse goes up? You gain the ability to focus. You lose something as well. You lose fine motor skills. The higher your pulse goes, at least up to a certain point, the more you can focus and also be stronger and faster than usual because of adrenaline. But there are serious side effects. You lose even more motor skills. And what you also lose, because just the blood is no longer flowing through those parts of the brain that efficiently, you lose the ability to do creative stuff on the spot. You just do the stuff that you have trained and trained and trained over and over and over. And that's why everybody else that has responder in their job description train until it comes out their ears. I mean, look at EMTs, look at any type of first responders, police, military. That's why those guys train until it comes out their ears, so this becomes muscle memory. So you just go through the motions. Pilots as well. I have a pilot's license. We love checklists and we love to train stuff because that reduces our mental load. If things go sideways, the rule in aviation is aviate, navigate, communicate. So fly the plane, know where you are, and then start talking to people about all the funny stuff falling off your plane, things like that. But you have to train this. So most of the private pilots are really, really afraid of talking to air traffic control, for example, because you never do it. So the simple fact of talking to another human being, which is very, very, very boilerplate, following certain protocols and procedures, so it should actually be easy if you memorize these, becomes an extremely stressful situations, and usually we mess it up if we don't train it as private pilots because we're not used to talking to ATC. And the same thing happens if we don't train the procedures we have to do in incident response or any type of fixing an environment in critical situations. So imagine you have something going wrong and whatever you're responsible for on the OT, ICS side, and your maintenance personnel not being trained in how to deal with that, and then not being trained in how to deal with that in really, really bad situations, like the water is already up here, or it's minus 20 degrees outside, or it's very, very hot. All these things that make life miserable in the real world. So keep these in mind. And yeah, what you should do all the time is, especially for your SOC, run them through these fire drills without prior warning. If you do them larger, you should let everybody know that this is an exercise. Who of you remembers, yeah, I'm not that old, but who remembers the story about War of the Worlds, the radio play, 1932 something? I don't remember exactly, but like all of Manhattan going, oh my God, the Martians are coming, boom, 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 boom. I've had this happen a couple of times because we plan these, especially the larger exercises, for a couple of months if they go really large. And still you forget calling someone on that huge list you have of people that should be aware there is an exercise going on. So, and they take it for real, and they start calling in real emergency personnel. Fortunately, usually we have all of those on board, but you should always remember it's an exercise, let everybody know, but if it's a small-scale fire drill that you can reduce, for example, to your SOC also, and if you know what you're doing, do them unannounced. So run your responsible incident response personnel through fire drills so they feel the actual stress. That's really important. And I've seen things happening in real incident response then when people are not used to dealing with stressful situations, when usually things turn all upside down. So let's look at an example scenario here. We detect malware in the ICS environment. So what do we do with malware in the ICS environment? What's the number one thing we have to do? Any ideas?
Identify what is the risk. Is it going to hurt the environment?
Exactly. Should I care about this to begin with? Right? Triage. Figure out if this malware will harm my environment or not. Usually there's a time frame involved in that, so the typical SANS example is that you learn in Forensics 508, so it has nothing to do with ICS. Still, I use that time frame in my ICS portion of my team as well. 30 minutes until we should figure out what the heck is going on. First report for leadership within 4 hours, latest. That doesn't mean it has to be complete, but it means at that point in time, we have a telco, and we tell people what's going on and give them something so they can make a more or less educated decision on what we should do now for the next couple of days. And that's really important. So this is also something you have to train your analysts in, because if you're an analyst, what is it you love doing? Analyzing, right? Figuring out what that is until you understand everything about it. And incident response is not the place and not the time to do that. Just figure out the risk exactly. Is it harmful to the portion of the environment where I found it? So do we have to deal with this in an accelerated fashion, or should we just monitor it and deal with it at a later date? And especially junior analysts need to be trained in this again and again and again, but I've also seen senior folks that weren't used to the ways of the ICS looking at this the wrong way. So this needs to be tailored also to your organization, of course. Also, communications. Again, think about the example I gave you with SOP, and I could come up with all these fancy acronyms that we have in the automotive industry, and then somebody of you from the chemical industry will completely outrun me with acronyms. So it's all different, right? So, but do the people in the same company actually know how to talk to one another? If your SOC calls your OT guys, what usually happens is somebody picks up the phone and gets a stream of acronyms and maybe figures out that something is wrong, but probably will just hang up the phone because they didn't understand a single thing they were trying to explain to them. And if this is also in a stressful situation, probably people are not explaining this in a calm manner. It's one of these crazy agitated phone calls you get sometimes from the help desk, right? So again, figure out what's going on and looking at aviation would be another good example here. Why not have some predefined phrases that will let everybody know what the situation is? So you've decided that this is risky to our organization, so let's trigger the playbook. We have found malware with possible impact to safety and reliability of this portion of the ICS, and now let's walk through the motions. And somebody should better sit there like with a stopwatch, very German thing, write down what people are doing, and then walk them through a post-action lessons learned type of thing. So how did we perform? How did this work? Where should we improve? Did we find any errors in our playbook? Things like that. Prerequisites. Incident response plans are absolutely necessary in playbooks as well. Again, as I mentioned before, you need to have this written down and trained and retrain it all the time, because otherwise this won't work. You can't improvise ad hoc even if you've done this for 20 years. Believe me, it will fail. If you have the stuff left over from previous actual incidents, so this is what we do in my organization. We work, of course, in virtual machines all the time because I send my folks to SANS trainings all the time. You learn to work with VMs, so we store these VMs as long as we're allowed to do with GDPR and all the other stuff, but these are perfect as training environments for new analysts, right? Just walk everybody else that didn't participate in this incident through the VM that you have from the previous incident, show them the malware, show them what you did, even if you didn't fully document what you were doing, which you should be, right? It should work like this. Write down the command in your documentation tool and then run it. Who does that? Exactly no one, including me. So you forgot the minute you typed the command what you actually did. So your friend is bash history, right? So it's all in the VM. So store that. Use it for training. Use it for the lessons learned, like post-activity, whatever you want to call it, to walk through what you did and where you could improve and what you need to put into your playbook so you're more effective in the future. Again, communications should be performed as the real thing if everybody involved knows that this is an exercise, and you shouldn't hit the red button to shut down the Audi manufacturing plant right now, because then my bosses would really hate me. But call the people. Figure out if these darn phone numbers actually still work. I can assure you that half of them don't. So this is why you have to do this as the real thing. Really, really important. So let's take this for the last couple of minutes, large scale. Anyone has done a large scale crisis management exercise in this room before? Maybe those of you that served in the military, because that's what they do all the time, right? So in this, we want to train leadership. So get in the bigwigs. OODA Loop, improve inter and intra-team communication. So maybe invite somebody from first responders in our municipality or wherever we are into the game as well. Exercise collaboration with everybody and have a fun time as well. So some caveats with this. When I got started with this, and I've done this for 6 years at Audi, once a year they let me out of my basement office and especially work together with the fire department and run these really huge exercises that we prepare for about 3 months ahead of time. The fun thing again is you can turn the company upside down completely, and you can see people that earn about 5 times the money you make per month with really, really sweaty armpits. But don't make them look bad. Right? That's the last thing you want to do. So give them scenarios they can actually somehow handle. Brief them beforehand. The last thing they want to do is get into a situation where others are watching them and then look real bad in this situation. So you want to have a lot of preparation. And depending on your cultures, in the US, this is a lot easier. In Germany, it's usually, why should we do these crazy games? We are a serious company. We do not play games. So you have to convince them how to do that. I guarantee you, once they get the hang of it, after 10, 20 minutes, they've completely forgotten they're inside a simulation. They're so involved the first thing that goes out the window in a large crisis management exercise is the awareness that this is an exercise, and that's a fun thing. And also let them know what winning is. So for the last 2 minutes, what have I done last November? So usually we run these exercises mid-November because then the weather is really bad. So if bad stuff happens, it's just another plus on what the fire department has to deal with. So my fire department was actually the department that I loved working with at Audi most, because these guys are pros. They're apolitical, so there's no political nitpicking games in company politics, and they train a lot. So usually for the first 30 minutes that we do in these types of exercises, we already start the game for the fire department. So something bad happens, and in such a massive amount and timing-wise that everybody that hasn't been trained as a first responder would start getting a nosebleed already. In those 30 minutes, we brief leadership. So we have another team that gives a PowerPoint presentation to the leadership, tells them what the exercise is about, reiterates the basics like OODA Loop and what we expect of them to do, and also explains to them what winning might mean in this scenario. I mean, you don't spill the beans, but you give them a framework. And then 30, 40 minutes into the game, thing happens. So what we had happen is the one thing that breaks the neck for any type of fire department, people going through the organization just with a basic set of tools like wire cutters, hammers, a chainsaw, and messing up the plant big way. So this is another reason why collaborating with your fire department is really important, because they know all the weak spots in your organization, every one of them, because they've seen it all, mostly. So the first time ever, I found the tunnels with them that go under all of the plant, so you can go from one end of the plant to the other through the tunnels very, very down in the basement, where the gas pipelines are and where you find those funky switches and valves where you can drain the gas pipelines, and right underneath them, there's electric power that you can create a spark with, so you can have some fun stuff happening. And it's actually quite realistic, because most of the stuff that we usually assemble in these crisis management exercises has happened on a smaller scale already in the organization, just not on a large orchestrated scale. So the fire department that can usually deal with all of this easily does not train to deal with an intelligent actor. So the threat in the definition of Idaho National Lab, so somebody with the capability, opportunity, and intent. Because fires and other scenarios that firefighters usually deal with don't fight back. So this way we completely derailed them, unfortunately. But the fun thing was they later on figured out a way of how to deal with that, how to collaborate with police, company, corporate security, how to get ahead of the adversary. Once they figured out they were dealing with an adversary, you could see them turning the tables. And that's what's really interesting, again, in these large-scale exercises. Seeing people starting collaborating, figuring out their own weak spots, hopefully, and then improving. And if they're not improving in the exercise, they're improving afterwards. So, because I'm running out of time, Not Petty, I Want to Cry. Again, you should read Sandworm, is a good example for that. These are a couple of the questions you should ask, and think back to Andy's presentation. Do we have a plan B? So if the thing happens that should not happen, what is actually our plan B, and how do we exercise through that? Do we know if it actually works? Do we know how long we can uphold that plan B? So if you have continuity folks in your organization, ask them what the time frames are, how long you can operate under these circumstances. Do you have to involve external people that help you to evacuate people, for example? All of that, again, without prior training, you will be completely overwhelmed. With that, this is what it takes to do. Get leadership buy-in. Once they've done this, once, twice, they will really like it, because you can make them shine, it's fun, and it helps you allocating more budget